So, spoilers for Elbaf. However, recently I got a comment by YouTube commenter and YouTube subscriber. So, if you subscribe and or comment, there's a chance that your comment could be referenced on the show here. But anyway, S3P8472 regarding the nature of Cerberus, because this was a comment on my Is Loki and Usopp Live Come True video. And in that video, I do discuss how technically, with the reveal of Figarland Shamrock's sword being Cerberus, the lie presented way back in chapter 40 of Usopp and the Usopp pirates chasing a Cerberus does come true, because with the sword eating some sort of mythical dog fruit and becoming a Cerberus, it is the real McCoy in the One Piece world. This parallels with the fake Cerberus presented to us in chapter 444 during Thriller Bark. But what's so interesting about the Cerberus there, which is a zombie, is that we actually get a lore drop of Cerberus and how it's perceived in the One Piece world. Because Usopp, I believe, says, since a kid Usopp knew what Cerberus was in the first place, he says, "I thought it was the guard dog of hell. Then this must be hell," talking about Thriller Bark. So, this is the only time in which Cerberus is put into context within One Piece. Now, when you parallel this with the Cerberus that we see in Elbaf, it makes a lot of sense. But that hell theming is going to be very important, because we meet the real Cerberus, meaning the sword of Figarland Shamrock, in the underworld of Elbaf. The underworld and hell are basically synonymous with one another in language, so that's thematic right there. But to continue, in this comment, it did remind me of a video that I had made previously and that I was going to follow up on in the future. Now we're in the future, because a while ago I made a video talking about how a cool upgrade for Brook was to have Cerberus as his next sword. And that makes some sense based on the lore of Cerberus, because Cerberus and music do have a relation with one another. And of course, dogs have a relation to bones, even in One Piece. However, an alternative to that theory is, and this is including the context of this comment, is that what if Blackbeard got his hands on Cerberus? Now, the commenter in question brings up, what if Shamrock's sword was originally Rocksteady's Abex's sword? I'm not sure if that would be the case, but that's something to keep in mind. However, if Shamrock is killed by the Blackbeard pirates, I could see that as a get back for Blackbeard not being able to finish off Shanks way back in the day, because we know, presumably, that Blackbeard is the one who gave Shanks his scar. Now, it's very interesting that Shanks has 3 slashes over his eye, and Cerberus has 3 heads. So I think that's a funny correlation. But if that were to happen to Figarland Shamrock, which is a very high possibility considering the Blackbeard pirates could be starting the trouble that we've been hearing about that's going on in Marriagewall right now. But if that's the case, I don't think it's going to be Blackbeard who gets Cerberus. I think it's going to be Shiryu. The reason why this is because, and we'll talk about this even more in another video, but Impel Down is considered hell in a bunch of different contexts in One Piece. And I've often thought that one of the levels of Impel Down could have been created by the effects of a Holy Knight's Devil Fruit, meaning Shepard Sommers, with his whole Thorn Fruit, and he created first level of Impel Down, presumably, and that's why all the trees and grass are spiky. But that's a whole nother video, but I'll put a link here for it. However, the idea is that Shiryu should get Cerberus, because Shiryu was a former warden of Impel Down. Therefore, he is themed after hell in that way, much like how Cerberus is themed after hell. So it makes sense that the warden of hell would have a guard dog of hell by his side. So I could see that also, seeing as how the reason why Impel Down is so fearsome is because of the combined reputation of Shiryu and Magellan, because Shiryu was a head jailer, which I found out is the same as a warden, so that doesn't really matter. But Ivankov tells us that Shiryu is the more experienced of the two, and the reason why Impel Down has such a terrible reputation, because Shiryu would just slaughter prisoners. But what's also very interesting about these two in this context is that with Shiryu getting Cerberus, it would parallel him very well to Magellan, because both of them would then be Greek monster themed. Because Magellan, using the powers of the Venom fruit, would make a construct called a Hydra. In Greek myth, a Hydra is a multi-headed serpent creature. In One Piece, it looks like a multi-headed amphitheater of some sort, so like a weird draconic-like creature, but the idea still remains. Both of them would have multi-headed monsters at their disposal, more or less. So I find that quite interesting. And Cerberus, in the context of Figarland Shamrock using him, can behead itself and turn itself into homing bladed head missiles of some kind, and we see this in Elbaf. So the theming is there, because the big thing about the Hydra is that in Greek mythology, if you cut one of its heads off, another head will grow in its place. So there is a big multi-head theme with the Hydra and now with Cerberus. So I could see that being a possibility in the future with these two. However, it would make a lot of sense for him to now have a hell-themed weapon. This would also parallel him very well with Zoro, because while Zoro uses the three-sword style, we see that even though Cerberus is a sword, he could split his sword body into three separate blades, with the blades coming out of the mouths of the dogs' heads. So I could see Shiryu being a parody off of Zoro in that way. While Zoro uses three-sword style, Shiryu has a three swords in one style, I guess you could say, with Cerberus being a sword originally. However, with that being said, it's also quite funny that in the present now, Shiryu himself is 44, and the first time that we see the Cerberus mentioned and Cerberus lore being dropped is in chapter 444, and the first time that Cerberus is even mentioned in the series is in chapter 40. In addition to this, which is also quite creepy, even though his debut was in chapter 538, in the anime, his debut was chapter 440. So we're getting a weird repetition of 40 here, or 4 in general, because the Cerberus was introduced in chapter 40. The lore regarding the Cerberus was introduced in chapter 444, and now Shiryu is 44, and his anime debut was episode 440. Again, this may not mean anything, but the repetition of the number 40 and 44 is interesting. On top of that, he is 340 centimeters tall, which translates into 11 foot 2, which 11 foot 2 broken down is just 4, because 1 plus 1 and 11 is 2, 2 plus 2 is 4. Again, that's weird, but continuing. So I find that kind of interesting. That may not go anywhere, but it's interesting that those numbers all correlate more or less. So with that being said, too, in talking about numbers, could you increase my numbers by liking the video if you're liking it, subscribing if you want to see more from me in the future, and ringing that bell so you never miss a Poly P Works video. In addition, if you could find it, please hit the hype button. It does help somehow. But to continue, also don't know if this is a parallel, but in Impel Down on the 5th level, which is called the Freezing Hell, we do meet ravenous dogs. This could parallel with the cold tundra of the underworld in Elbaf, of which we meet Cerberus, who, though he is not a wolf, he is a ravenous dog zoan. Just pointing that out as a parallel of how Shiryu could get Cerberus in the future. But in getting back to Figarland Shamrock, I could see this being a new theme that we're seeing in One Piece, in which Devil Fruit users have Devil Fruit weapons, because Shiryu is the user of the Clear Fruit, so he will be the user of the Clear Fruit with a Devil Fruit item. So I could see that. However, too, what's also quite interesting about this as well is that way back when, I believe during an SBS, we do find out that out of all the non-Devil Fruit using Straw Hats, if Zoro were to have a Devil Fruit, he would be in a very similar situation to what I'm proposing for Shiryu, because it said that he himself would not eat a Devil Fruit. One of his swords would eat Kaido's Devil Fruit, which is the Fish Fruit model Azure Dragon. So that's how Shiryu parallels with Zoro as well in this way, because in a hypothetical situation, Zoro would be a person who uses a Devil Fruit using item as well. So I could see Shiryu fulfilling that and being someone who uses a Devil Fruit using item. But with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede. What?